It has been highly requested that I do more creepy horror kind of stories. We have a real story today that someone shared of working the graveyard shift at a gas station. Not our typical drama. So this story is titled, "My boss gave me a strict list of rules for the night shift. I just found out why I have to mop the bathroom at exactly 3:15 a.m. Working the graveyard shift at a desolate highway gas station completely strips away your sense of time. The long, cracked stretches of asphalt extending in both directions remains entirely empty for hours. The fluorescent lights overhead hum with a constant irritating vibration that settles deep into your teeth. I took the job because my bank account was completely depleted and the owner paid entirely in cash at the end of every single week. Would you guys work that job? Couldn't be me. I watch way too much true crime to be in that position. He was an older, heavy-set man who constantly chewed on unlit cigars and rarely looked me in the eyes when he spoke. During my first night, the owner handed me a heavy wooden clipboard holding a single sheet of lined paper. He tapped his thick finger against the top of the page and said, "The register automatically locks at midnight. You only accept cash through this sliding transaction window. You stay behind the bulletproof glass until 6 in the morning." I wrote down the daily tasks. You sweep the aisles, restock the coolers, and wipe down the coffee machines. You follow the list exactly as I wrote it. Do we understand each other? "I understand," I said, taking the clipboard. "Is there anything else I need to know about the security system?" "The cameras record to a digital drive under the counter," he said, turning around the heavy glass door. "Do not mess with the drive, just read the list. Stick to the list and you will get your envelope on Friday." This is already sounding very sketchy. After he drove away, leaving me completely alone in the building, I sat on the tall metal stool behind the counter and I read the instructions. The first 3 rules were completely standard retail procedures regarding inventory and cleaning schedules. Rule number 4 was written in thick, heavily pressed red ink. If a rusted white van pulls up to pump 2 at 3 a.m., the driver will get out and walk to the transaction window. He will ask for the bathroom key. Give him the heavy brass key hanging on the hook under the register. Do not give him the standard plastic key. When he leaves the property, take the mop and bucket into the bathroom immediately. Clean the floor. Do not touch the water on the tiles with your bare hands. Use the thick rubber gloves provided in the utility closet. What? What are you cleaning up?
What do you mean?
I stared at the red ink for a long time. The extremely specific instructions felt deeply unsettling. I assumed it was simply a quirk of the job, perhaps dealing with a regular customer, eccentric local resident of some kind who had some kind of mental condition. The deep isolation of the highway breeds strange habits, and I needed the weekly cash far too much to question the logistics of cleaning the bathroom floor. I feel like I would just be waiting for that white van to pull up, though. The rusted white van arrived on my 3rd night. I was wiping down the glass surface of the hot dog roller when the harsh headlights cut through the darkness outside. I watched the vehicle pull slowly into the glowing circle of light cast by the overhead canopy. It parked perfectly parallel to the second fuel pump. The engine idled a rough, choking sputter. The exterior of the van was heavily corroded, the metal eaten away by years of severe rust and neglect. The rear windows were completely blacked out with peeling tint. The driver's door opened with a loud screech. A man stepped out onto the concrete pad. He wore a dark canvas coat and loose jeans. As he walked through the bulletproof glass of the transaction window, I noticed his heavy boots were leaving wet footprints across the dry pavement. He moved with a slow, dragging walk. I stepped behind the register and I waited. The man stopped directly in front of the glass. His appearance sent a wave of adrenaline through my chest. His skin was incredibly pale, bearing a sickly gray complexion that completely lacked the natural flush of circulating blood. His dark hair was entirely plastered to his skull, dripping steadily onto the collar of his heavy coat. He looked as though he had just crawled out of a freezing river. The smell penetrated the small gap in the transaction window immediately. It was a dense, suffocating odor of stagnant water and wet mud. "I need the key," the driver said. "Which one?" I asked, my hands trembling slightly as I reached under the counter. "The heavy key," he said, staring blankly at me. He never made eye contact. I pulled the thick brass key off the hidden hook and I slid it through the metal transaction tray. The driver took it with a pale hand. His fingers were severely wrinkled, the skin puckered from extreme water exposure. He turned around and walked slowly toward the exterior bathroom doors located on the side of the building. "Oh, so are you cleaning up the water that he's dripping in?" It honestly sounds like a horror movie. I can see this being a scene in one. I watched the surveillance monitor sitting on the counter. The screen displayed the black and white feed from the camera pointing at the side entrances. I watched the driver insert the heavy brass key, open the door, and step inside into the darkness. Exactly 15 minutes later, the bathroom door opened. The driver emerged, walked back to the transaction window, and dropped the brass key into the metal tray. He did not say a single word. He returned to his rested van, started the choking engine, and drove away into the darkness of the highway. I grabbed the rubber gloves from the utility closet, filled the yellow plastic mop bucket with hot water and bleach, and I walked outside. The freezing night air bit my face. I unlocked the bathroom door and I stepped inside. The floor was completely flooded. A layer of dark, murky water covered the white tiles. The smell of stagnant mud and decay was overwhelmingly powerful in this enclosed space. I remember the rule written in red ink. I kept the thick rubber gloves pulled over high on top of my forearms and I began to mop. I wrung the dark water into the bucket, pouring the filthy contents down the utility drain, and I scrubbed the tiles until they were completely dry. I locked the door and I returned to the safety of the enclosure. This routine continued flawlessly for 6 weeks. Every single night at exactly 3 in the morning, the rusted van pulled up to the second pump. The pale driver asked for the heavy key, went into the bathroom for 15 minutes, returned the key, and drove away. I put on the rubber gloves, mopped the floor, and disposed of the murky water. The repetition of the event slowly eroded my initial terror, transforming the bizarre encounter into just another mundane chore on a nightly checklist. The breaking point happened on a Tuesday night during a relentless rainstorm. The van arrived on schedule. The driver completed his slow, silent transaction and retreated to the side of the building. After he returned the key and drove away into the heavy rain, I gathered my cleaning supplies. I pulled the heavy rubber gloves up to my elbows, grabbed the mop, and I wheeled the plastic bucket out to the bathroom. I opened the door and I flipped on the light. The floor was flooded, bearing the usual layer of dark, foul-smelling water. I set the bucket down near the sink and I began to push the mop across the slick tiles. I was exhausted, my muscles aching from the cold dampness of the night. I pushed the waterlogged mop head towards the corner of the room, using entirely too much force. The wooden handle slipped aggressively from my wet grip. The heavy mop collided violently with the side of the yellow bucket. The plastic container tipped entirely over, spilling the mixture of bleach and collected floor water across the tiles in a chaotic splash. I let out a frustrated sigh and I crouched down on my knees to right the bucket. Don't touch the water, don't touch the water. As I reached down, I noticed the solid debris scattered across the wet tiles. The dark water left behind by the driver always contained small amounts of grit, but the spill had spread the contents of the bucket out into a thin layer, exposing the larger particles. I leaned closer, inspecting the debris sticking to the wet porcelain of the toilet base. They were long, thick strands of dark green weeds. The plant matter was slimy, coated in a thick layer of river mud. Scattered among the weeds were several small, jagged fragments of decaying wood and rusted metal fasteners. The smell rising from the spilled water was intensely concentrated. The bleach could not mask the stench. I stood up slowly, a primal unease settling into my stomach. I finished cleaning the floor in a frantic, panicked rush, ensuring that I did not touch a single drop of that foul water on my bare skin. I locked the bathroom, sprinted back through the pouring rain, and sealed myself inside the bulletproof enclosure. I sat on the tall metal stool and I stared at the surveillance monitor. I thought this time I wanted to know exactly what the driver was doing inside the room for 15 minutes every single night. I grabbed the computer mouse and I pulled up the digital recording archive. I selected the timestamp for 3 in the morning and I pressed play. The black and white footage showed the rusted van pulling up to the pump. The driver stepped out, walked to my window, and then moved towards the side of the building. The camera perfectly captured him inserting the brass key and stepping into the bathroom. The door pulled completely shut behind him. I watched the time code ticking in the bottom corner of the screen. 1 minute passed, 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes passed. I stared intensely at the door on the monitor, waiting for the driver to emerge. The time code hit exactly 15 minutes. The camera feed glitched. A thick brand of digital static rolled aggressively down the screen, disrupting the video signal for a fraction of a second. When the picture stabilized, the metal bathroom door was completely closed. I frowned, rewinding the footage by 30 seconds. I watched the door again. The static rolled down the screen. The door remained entirely shut. I fast forwarded the video. The time code advanced to 20 minutes, then 30 minutes. The door was never opened. I pulled up the exterior camera, pointing at the gas pumps. The rusted white van was sitting next to the second pump at 14 minutes past the hour. At exactly 15 minutes, the camera experienced the exact same burst of digital static. When the picture cleared, the van was completely gone. Is anyone else like, this is a ghost? Like a spirit, an entity? I don't know what the proper word is, but you know what I mean? Are we on the same page over here? I pushed the computer mouse away, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The rational, logical part of my brain demanded that I ignore the footage. It demanded that I accept the paycheck and continue just mopping the floor. But the horror of the situation completely hijacked my nervous system. I needed to understand the reality of that bathroom. I grabbed the brass key from the hook under the register. I grabbed my flashlight from my backpack and I walked back out into the pouring rain. I unlocked the bathroom door and I stepped inside, shutting it firmly behind me. I turned off the light, plunging the small room into darkness, and I engaged the beam of my flashlight. I swept the bright circle of light across the tiles, the cheap porcelain sink, and the metal toilet stall. The room was entirely mundane. There were no hidden alcoves, no removable ceiling tiles, and absolutely no secondary exits. It was a solid cinder block box. I looked down at the brass key resting in my palm. The teeth of the key were incredibly complex, far too intricate for the cheap standard commercial lock mounted on the exterior door. The key belonged to a different mechanism. I dropped to my knees on the damp tiles and I crawled towards the space directly beneath the sink. The plumbing pipes ran down directly into the concrete floor, surrounded by a thick, rusted metal base plate. I shined the flashlight directly onto the metal plate. Hidden completely on the underside of the heavy iron disc, obscured by decades of accumulated grime and hard water stains, was a small, circular keyhole. Raise your hand if you're unlocking that keyhole. Certainly not. Certainly not. My breath caught in my throat. I slowly inserted the brass key into the hidden slot. It slid perfectly into place. I gripped the brace bow and I turned it forcefully to the right. A loud clack echoed violently beneath the concrete floor. I grabbed the edges of the rusted metal base plate and I pulled upward. The entire section of the tile floor beneath the sink lifted smoothly away, revealing a dark square opening, plunging straight down into the foundation of the building. A wave of putrid air aggressively rushed up the hole, carrying the overwhelming, gagging stench of something dead. That's why you don't open the keyhole. I aimed my flashlight down into the opening. A narrow rusted iron ladder descended roughly 10 feet into a massive bunker. The beam of light illuminated a horrific, devastating reality. The entire underground space was flooded, holding at least 4 feet of dark, murky river water. Floating completely stagnant on the surface of the foul liquid were dozens of decaying, waterlogged suitcases, torn canvas duffel bags, and children's backpacks. Protruding violently from the dark water, tangled deeply in the thick strands of aquatic river weeds, were human skeleton remains. Ghost. Called it! There were dozens of them. Pale, stained skulls resting against the concrete walls, rib cages wrapped tightly in decaying, algae-covered clothing, small, fragile bones sinking deeply into the thick layer of mud coating the floor of the bunker. I fell backwards, away from the hole, scrambling frantically across the wet bathroom tiles. I covered my mouth with both hands, suppressing a violent surge of nausea, my mind spitting chaotically as the pieces of the nightmare slammed together. A sharp, aggressive knock echoed violently against the exterior bathroom door. My entire body lodged into a rigid state of paralysis. I stared wildly at the door. I had locked the deadbolt when I stepped inside. "Who's out there?" I yelled, my voice cracking severely. There was no response. The driving rain continued to beat heavily against the roof of the building. I slowly pushed myself off the floor, keeping the beam of my flashlight trained directly on that door handle. I took a slow, trembling step forward. I reached out, grabbed the cold metal lock, and I turned the deadbolt. I pulled the door open and pointed the flashlight directly out into the rain. The concrete walkway was completely empty. The glowing perimeter of the gas station was entirely deserted. I stood in the doorway, staring out into the empty storm, the cold rain blowing aggressively across my face. Then I heard the sound. It came from directly behind me, originating deep inside the small enclosed space of the bathroom. It was a heavy, dragging footstep. The sickening, skelching sound of a completely waterlogged boot pressing firmly against the wet tile floor. Before the ghost creeps up on him, I need a sip of water. So cheers. Drink your water. You guys, Lila and I are on a walk right now, and the clouds look like the clouds from Toy Story. Hold on. Is it just me, or do these clouds not look like the wallpaper from Toy Story? The heavy trapdoor beneath the sink was still wide open. I turned my head slowly, moving with an agonizing, terrified hesitation, shining the beam back into the bathroom. Standing between the open trapdoor and the sink was the driver. He did not look like the pale, dripping man who stood outside the transaction window. His physical form had completely deteriorated into a state of something horrifying. His body was massively bloated, his skin swollen and stretched tightly over the expanding tissues. The flesh was a sticky purple, slouching off his jawbone in thick, wet strips. Dark, murky water poured heavily from his open, rotting mouth, cascading down his chest and soaking it into the ruined fabric of his heavy canvas coat. He raised a bloated, decaying hand, the long, jagged fingernails pointing directly at my face. Then he took a dragging step towards me. I abandoned the flashlight, dropped it onto the wet concrete, and I sprinted blindly out into the rain. I ran with desperate adrenaline, tearing across the flooded parking lot towards the glass doors of the main building. I heard the aggressive, wet slapping of his dragging boots moving rapidly behind me, closing the distance with a terrifying and unnatural speed. I got goosies on my legs. Goosebumps. I hate, the thought of being chased. Terrifying. Like when stuff starts crawling at you in movies, just catch me. I won't even run, just catch me. I reached the glass doors, threw my entire body weight against the metal handles, and practically fell into the brightly lit interior. I scrambled wildly behind the main counter, ignoring the transaction window entirely, and threw myself violently against the solid wooden door leading into the owner's private back office. I twisted the heavy brass lock, securing the deadbolt just as a massive, devastating impact slammed aggressively against the other side of the wood. The door shut shuddered violently on its hinges. A low, gurgling, watery roar echoed heavily through the walls of the gas station. I backed away from the locked door, my chest heaving with deep, frantic gasps for air. The small windowless office was cluttered with tall metal filing cabinets, stacks of cardboard inventory boxes, and a wooden desk positioned in the center of the room. I pulled my cell phone out from my damp pocket. My fingers were shaking so severely that I could barely unlock the screen. I pulled up the owner's contact number and I pressed the call button. Holding the phone tightly against my ear, the call immediately failed. The screen displayed a harsh "no network connection" error. Always. In every horror movie ever, you lose cell phone reception. Can't call for help. The severe storm outside had completely knocked out the cellular towers in the region. I was entirely cut off from the outside world. The wet impacts against the door ceased. The gas station fell into a deep, oppressive silence, broken only by the steady drumming of the rain on the roof. I needed something to defend myself. I began frantically tearing through the cluttered office, pulling open the heavy metal drawers of the filing cabinets, searching desperately for a firearm, a heavy metal tool, or a sharp object. The drawers contained nothing but endless stacks of tax documents, vendor receipts, and old payroll. I moved to the wooden desk, pulling aggressively on the locked bottom drawer, but it refused to open. I grabbed a metal paperweight sitting on the desktop and I smashed it violently against the cheap lock mechanism until the wood splintered and gave way. I pulled the drawer open. There was no weapon inside. Resting at the bottom of the drawer was a thick, leather-bound notebook and a small iron lockbox. I grabbed the notebook and I flipped it open. The pages were filled with the owner's messy, slanted handwriting. It was not an inventory ledger. It was a detailed accounting of human trafficking. What? The entries explicitly detailed the owner's highly lucrative side business. He used the isolated location of the gas station as a transfer point for undocumented immigrants being smuggled across the border. The owner used the underground concrete bunker hidden underneath the bathroom as a temporary holding cell, locking the desperate people in the dark while he collected transit fees from their families. I turned the pages rapidly. I stopped on an entry dated exactly 7 years ago. The handwriting in this specific entry was deeply pressed into the paper, frantic and chaotic. The storm breached behind the tree line, the entry read. The runoff flooded the drainage pipes. It backed up directly into the bunker ventilation system. I could hear the screaming from the office. I could hear them beating against the bottom of the trapdoor. The water filled the concrete box in less than 20 minutes. They all drowned in the dark. I am not opening the trapdoor. I am keeping the cash, and the concrete is thick enough to hide the smell. I stared at the page, a profound, sickening realization settling heavily into my brain. I turned to the final, most recent entry in the book. It said, "The driver came tonight. I think he was one of them. I know that because of the white van. I remember him. He was working in delivery with it in his home and wanted to come here for a better life to provide for his family. Sadly, this is how life goes on. They are dead down there and I am up here alive. The problem is he pulled up to the pump at 3 a.m, asked for the key. I think he is still convinced that he is alive and he wants to open the door and let them out. The dead do not know that they are dead. I think he is trapped in the routine. So as long as I give him the brass key, he goes into the bathroom, tries to open the rusted floor plate, and then disappears. He just needs to try. As long as I let him run his ghost routine, he does not come into the store and the new kid can handle the floor." I'm good. I don't need cash that bad. I retreated to the furthest corner of a small room, pressing my back tightly against the cold metal of the filing cabinets. I pulled my knees to my chest, gripping the leather notebook tightly in my trembling hands. The impacts continued against the door for hours. I listened to the horrific, wet, tearing sounds of bloated flesh pressing against the wood. I listened to the low, gurgling moans echoing through the narrow gap. The smell of decay in the office became entirely suffocating, burning into my lungs. I squeezed my eyes eyes tightly shut, praying silently to a universe I barely understood, waiting for the door to finally shatter completely, but it never did. The violent assault against the door abruptly ceased exactly as the first faint rays of morning sunlight began to bleed through the cracks in the exterior window blinds. The gurgling sounds faded entirely. The wet, dragging footsteps retreated slowly across the floor of the main store, moving towards the exterior doors. I heard the sharp, distant screech of a rusted metal van door opening and slamming shut. I heard a rough, choking engine start and the sounds of tires rolling away across the wet asphalt. I remained locked in the office for another complete hour, utterly terrified that the silence was a trap. When the wall clock hit 7 in the morning, I finally stood up, unlocked the deadbolt, and slowly pushed the splintered door open. The gas station was completely empty. The floors were heavily stained with dark, foul-smelling mud, and thick puddles of murky river water covered it, but the bloated driver was gone. The owner always arrived for the morning shift at exactly 8 o'clock to collect the cash register deposits. I walked behind the counter, picked up the main landline phone, and dialed emergency services. The landline connection was perfectly stable. I explicitly told the dispatcher to send multiple units to the gas station immediately. I told them exactly where to find the trapdoor under the bathroom sink. I sat on the tall metal stool and I waited. The police cruisers arrived in a chaotic flurry of flashing lights and wailing sirens just as the owner's heavy pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. I walked out of the building, handed the thick leather notebook directly to the cops, and I pointed silently towards the heavy-set owner standing by his truck. I watched the color drain from his face as the police officers read the ledger. I watched them place the handcuffs over his wrists and shove him forcefully into the back of a patrol car. I gave a lengthy statement to the authorities, and I detailed the evidence of the bunker, the notebook, and the financial ledgers. I did not mention anything about the haunted routine of the driver. The police did not need ghost stories to secure a conviction. The massive flooded tomb hidden beneath the foundation was more than enough evidence to put the owner in a concrete cell for the rest of his life. I am unemployed again and my bank account is still empty, but I do not care. I am alive. I keep thinking about the rusted white van pulling away from the gas station in the morning light. The trap door in the bathroom was finally opened. The horrific secret was entirely exposed, and the man responsible for that atrocity was dragged away in chains. I stare at the ceiling of my apartment, listening to the morning rain hit my window, and I truly hope the driver finally got his closure. I hope the drowned souls resting in the dark can finally leave the bunker. Well, that's the most insane story I've ever read, I think. Yeah, I don't like that. I don't like that at all. I really want to know though, everyone's opinions are going to be different, so let's all be respectful if they don't match each other's. I want to know if you believe in the paranormal, in spirits, in ghosts, I don't know. I honestly don't know the difference. Spirits, ghosts. Some people believe spirits can live on. I just want to know what your thoughts are on anything paranormal, okay? Let me know in the comments. Stay classy out there, stay sassy, and I'll see you tomorrow. Hopefully you can sleep tonight. I might not be able to.